The signal was older than the desert. Not weak, not broken, just buried. My scanner didn't detect it at first. It couldn't, because whatever was beneath the sand wasn't emitting energy. It was absorbing it. Every photon from the sun, every vibration from the wind, every thermal fluctuation from the cooling surface of the planet. All of it was being quietly pulled downward into something massive, something precise. I almost missed it. At first, it looked like a simple thermal shadow, a cold imprint beneath the dunes. But shadows don't have structure. Shadows don't have geometry. This did. Perfect curvature. Smooth. Intentional. Not natural. I adjusted the scanner resolution. That's when the shape emerged. A ring. No, not a ring. A segment of something far larger. Most crash sites show chaos. Twisted alloys. Violent impact signatures. Debris scattered across kilometers. This was different. This wasn't destruction. This was placement. Half buried beneath thousands of tons of sand was a colossal alien structure. Matte black surface. Smooth, uninterrupted contours. No visible seams. No corrosion. It hadn't crashed here. It had settled, and the sand hadn't covered it randomly. The sand had flowed around it, like water around a stone that had been sitting there for a very long time. My scanner pinged again. Still no emissions. But now I knew why. It wasn't inactive. It was waiting. Waiting without decay. Waiting without power. Waiting without time. I stepped forward, boots sinking into the soft surface. The air was still. Too still. Even the wind seemed reluctant to touch it. I reached out my hand. Not to touch it, just to measure proximity. And that's when the scanner changed. For the first time since I arrived, it responded to me. If you want to see what happens when alien technology wakes up after centuries buried beneath a planet's surface, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and comment what you think this structure really is. Because what happens next was never meant to be witnessed. At first, I thought it was a malfunction. The scanner's baseline readings had been stable for hours. Zero emissions. Zero activity. Just the silent presence of something impossibly large beneath the sand. But now, there was a deviation. Small, precise, real. A faint energy gradient had formed exactly where I was standing. Not inside the structure. Around me. I froze. The scanner pulsed again, confirming it wasn't environmental interference. The change wasn't coming from the sun, the atmosphere, or the desert floor. It was coming from the object, and it wasn't broadcasting. It was measuring. I slowly crouched, lowering the scanner closer to the exposed surface. The black alloy was unlike anything I'd seen before. No scratches, no oxidation, no microfractures from thermal stress. It hadn't just survived here. It had remained untouched by time itself. I extended a secondary probe, a passive contact filament designed to read surface conductivity without introducing external energy. The filament hovered millimeters above the hull, waiting, recording, and then the filament moved. Not by my command, not by wind. It shifted sideways, gently, as if something beneath the surface had adjusted its position to align with it. My breath caught. The structure wasn't reacting randomly. It was reacting intentionally. The probe's readings stabilized instantly, as if the object had optimized itself to allow the scan. That shouldn't be possible. Passive scans don't trigger responses, unless the system being scanned is capable of independent observation. I withdrew the filament slowly. The scanner followed. Whatever awareness existed beneath the sand had already noticed me, and it wasn't shutting down. It was continuing. New readings appeared. Internal density mapping, layered construction, deep internal cavities extending far below the visible structure. This wasn't debris. This was a complete vessel, buried with precision, preserved with purpose. And then something happened that no abandoned object should ever do. The temperature of the surface increased by 0.3 degrees. Localized, controlled, right where I was standing. Not enough to activate, just enough to acknowledge. It knew my position, and it was adjusting itself accordingly. Not waking up, not yet, but no longer asleep. I expanded the scan radius. If this was a vessel, I needed to understand its true scale. The exposed segment was massive, but the scanner suggested it extended much deeper, much farther. The projection slowly assembled in front of me, line by line, contour by contour, and then I saw it. This wasn't a ship in the way we understood ships. There was no clear front, no clear rear, no visible propulsion structures. Instead, it was composed of interlocking curved segments, arranged in a partial circular configuration, like a fragment of something designed to connect with other fragments. Not incomplete, modular. The buried mass extended nearly 480 meters beneath the surface. That alone was impossible. Impact physics made it clear. If an object of this size had struck the planet, the surrounding geology would show catastrophic displacement. There would be fractures, melt signatures, compression zone. There were none. The sand layers beneath it were undisturbed, which meant only one thing. It hadn't entered from above. It had either been constructed here or placed with absolute control. I redirected the scan deeper into the central mass. Internal voids appeared. Massive hollow chambers arranged symmetrically, connected by narrow conduits that spiraled inward toward a dense core. But the core itself remained unreadable. Not shielded, not damaged, just undefined, as if the scanner couldn't interpret it. That had never happened before. Every material, no matter how advanced, interacted with scans in predictable ways. This didn't. It wasn't blocking the signal. It was absorbing it completely, as if it didn't want to be seen. Then the energy readings shifted again, not from the core, from the outer surface. A faint linear pattern appeared beneath the sand, a thin channel, extending away from the main structure. I increased resolution. The channel wasn't random. It was a pathway, precise, deliberate. It extended outward for nearly 90 meters before disappearing into the deeper substrate. A connection point, or an interface, something that had once linked this vessel to something else, something no longer here, or something still buried nearby. I turned slowly, scanning the surrounding desert. For the first time since arriving, the ship no longer felt like an isolated object. It felt like part of a system. And systems don't exist alone. They exist for a reason. And whatever reason this one had, it was still active. The pathway beneath the sand wasn't random erosion. It was engineered. I followed it. Each step felt different now. The desert was no longer just terrain. It was a surface concealing intent. My scanner tracked the buried conduit as it extended outward in a perfectly straight line, cutting through geological layers without disturbing them. That level of precision wasn't just advanced. It was surgical. 90 meters from the main hull, the readings intensified. The buried line widened slightly, then flattened, forming a disc-shaped anomaly roughly 4 meters in diameter beneath the sand. An access node, not exposed, hidden. I knelt and brushed away the top layer carefully. Sand slid off in smooth sheets, revealing a circular plate. Same matte black alloy, same seamless construction. No markings, no symbols, no visible control panel. Just a perfect surface. The scanner trembled slightly in my hand. Energy was beginning to circulate between this node and the main structure. Faint, coordinated, like a heartbeat synchronizing across distance. I didn't touch it immediately. Instead, I ran a low-frequency resonance test, a harmless vibration pulse to see how the material would respond. The response came instantly, not with noise, not with movement, with alignment. The surface shifted microscopically, forming a shallow indentation exactly where my scanner was aimed. Not random, not mechanical error. It was guiding the interaction. This wasn't just a machine. It was adaptive. I lowered the scanner into the indentation. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the sand around me moved, not violently, not dramatically, just enough to notice. A subtle compression wave radiated outward from the node, flattening the surrounding dunes by a few centimeters. The wind didn't cause it. The ship did. My scanner display changed entirely. The chaotic density map was replaced by a clean structural blueprint. Layers, pathways, chambers, all perfectly rendered. It wasn't blocking the scan anymore. It was providing the data. The core that had been unreadable before was now visible. And at its center was something I hadn't expected. Not a power source, not an engine, a lattice. A crystalline lattice structure suspended in zero-point equilibrium. Stable, active, and synchronized with the planet's tectonic rhythm. This wasn't transportation technology. It was stabilization technology. The ship wasn't here by accident. It was here to maintain something planetary, and I had just accessed its interface. The blueprint did not disappear. It remained projected across my scanner display with perfect clarity, as if the structure had made a deliberate decision to stop hiding itself and instead reveal its internal architecture in a form that I could understand, interpret, and, most importantly, respond to. This was not passive exposure. This was cooperation. Every chamber, every conduit, every structural layer was arranged with an elegance that suggested not only superior engineering, but a level of intentional design that accounted for forces far beyond simple mechanical stress or environmental survival. The crystalline lattice at the core remained the focal point of the projection, suspended within a cavity that existed in complete thermal isolation, unaffected by external temperature, pressure, or electromagnetic fluctuation, as if the structure had created its own internal reality governed by entirely different rules. And then the lattice shifted, not physically, not spatially, but energetically. The scanner registered a slight increase in harmonic resonance, a frequency adjustment so precise and controlled that it could not have been accidental, nor could it have been the result of delayed system recovery or residual automated processes completing their initialization cycles. It was reacting to something immediate, something present, something alive. Me. I slowly lifted the scanner away from the interface node, expecting the projection to collapse, expecting the structure to withdraw its cooperation once the direct link was broken, but it did not. The blueprint remained stable. The resonance remained elevated. The system had already completed its observation. The connection was no longer dependent on proximity, which meant the interaction had transitioned from physical contact to recognition. Recognition implied classification. Classification implied interpretation. And interpretation implied that the structure was no longer simply measuring my presence, but actively integrating it into its operational awareness. The desert around me remained silent, yet the silence itself now carried weight, because I understood that I was no longer standing next to an abandoned object, nor even a dormant system waiting for external activation. I was standing within the perception field of something that had just acknowledged me as part of its environment. Not an intruder, not a threat, but not irrelevant either. The scanner registered a second change, deeper within the core lattice, where energy pathways that had remained inactive for centuries began to realign themselves in slow, deliberate sequences, forming new connections that had not existed moments before. It was not restarting. It was adapting. And whatever it was adapting for, it had chosen to begin now. The first physical change did not happen inside the structure. It happened beneath my feet. At first, it was so subtle that I questioned whether it had occurred at all, because the desert floor did not crack, collapse, or shift violently, but instead stabilized in a way that deserts are never supposed to stabilize, as if the sand itself had suddenly remembered how to become solid again. For hours, the ground around the structure had behaved like a fluid medium, constantly redistributing itself, flowing along invisible gradients created by forces I could not see. But now that movement had stopped completely, replaced by a firmness that suggested the external field responsible for destabilizing local gravity had either weakened or reorganized. My instruments confirmed it immediately. Gravitational variance dropped by 0.8%. Not enough to be noticeable to the human body, but enough to prove that the structure was no longer maintaining its previous equilibrium. It was adjusting it, and that adjustment was synchronized perfectly with the moment the structure had recognized my presence through the interface node. This was not coincidence. This was response. I turned back toward the exposed lattice cavity, watching closely for any visible motion. But the crystalline core remained physically still, its surfaces reflecting sunlight with the same matte indifference as before, betraying nothing about the immense internal changes that were now unfolding beyond the limits of direct observation. Then the scanner emitted a tone I had never heard before. Not a warning, not an error, a handshake signal. The device was receiving structured data from the structure itself, transmitted not through conventional electromagnetic channels, but through localized field modulation, using the same invisible medium that had been distorting my equipment since arrival. This was deliberate communication, not random emissions, not automated diagnostics, targeted transmission. The data appeared slowly, line by line, resolving into structural diagnostics that were far more detailed than anything my scanner had been capable of producing independently, including internal stress distributions, resonance stability thresholds, and energy containment tolerances measured with impossible precision. The structure was showing me its condition. It was revealing its weaknesses. It was asking for intervention, but it was also measuring my response time, measuring hesitation, measuring intent. Because the moment I stepped forward, bringing the scanner closer to the exposed interface, the resonance frequency inside the lattice increased again, adjusting itself in anticipation of contact that had not yet occurred. It was predicting my actions, not reacting to them, predicting them. And that meant one thing I had not allowed myself to consider until now. The structure was no longer waiting to be repaired. It was waiting to be understood. The diagnostics the structure transmitted were not organized the way human systems organize failure. There were no warnings, no highlighted critical zones, no prioritais repercuss. Instead, there was only probability. Probability curves extending forward through time, mapping structural stability not as a fixed condition, but as a continuous negotiation between containment and release, balance and collapse, endurance and surrender. And at the center of every projection was the crystalline lattice, not as a power source, not as a processor, but as a regulator maintaining equilibrium against a force that the structure itself had not created, but had been designed to restrain. That realization changed everything, because it meant this was not a crash ship. It was a restraint system, a containment mechanism. The outer hull was not armor. It was insulation. The lattice was not a core. It was a lock. And the lock was weakening. The scanner highlighted microscopic fractures along the lattice's inner surfaces, fractures so small they existed at the edge of measurable resolution. Yet their impact on overall stability was exponential, not linear, because each fracture reduced the lattice's ability to maintain harmonic coherence across its entire structure. Containment systems do not fail all at once. They fail gradually, gracefully, giving time for correction, time that had already passed. The probability curve showed it clearly. Containment integrity was still above critical threshold, but the margin was shrinking, not rapidly, not catastrophically, but inevitably. And the most disturbing part was the timestamp. The degradation had begun long before I arrived, long before human civilization had even developed the technology required to detect it. This structure had been maintaining its function alone for centuries, maybe longer, without assistance, without maintenance, without supervision, which meant whoever built it had never intended to return. They had built something designed to outlast them, something designed to hold, until it couldn't. And now, for the first time since its creators had left, the system had encountered something new. Not a replacement, not a successor, but an observer capable of intervention. The scanner highlighted the interface node again, not as a suggestion, not as a command, but as an option. The structure was not forcing me to act. It was allowing me to choose. But the probability curves did not stop calculating while I stood there. Every second I hesitated, the margin continued to shrink. Slowly, quietly, irreversibly. I had two choices: walk away and leave the structure to continue its silent struggle against forces I did not yet fully understand, or step inside a system that was never designed for me. The interface node remained open, its surface slightly recessed where my scanner had last connected, as if waiting for confirmation that I intended to proceed further. The probability curves continued updating in real time, subtle but relentless, projecting decades of slow degradation that would eventually cross a threshold from stability into release. Not explosion, not impact, release. Whatever the lattice was containing would not detonate. It would emerge. And the structure had just shown me that it was no longer confident it could maintain equilibrium indefinitely. I knelt at the node and removed the scanner from my wrist mount, placing it directly into the indentation without hesitation this time. The surface sealed around it instantly, not aggressively, but seamlessly, integrating the device into the alloy as if it had always belonged there. A pulse traveled outward from the node toward the main body of the structure. The sand around the exposed hull began to recede, not blown away, not displaced by force, drawn downward, as if gravity itself had briefly shifted direction. Panels that had been invisible beneath the sand rotated upward, forming a curved aperture along the exposed segment of the vessel. No grinding, no mechanical noise, just fluid motion. An entrance, not carved open, revealed. Cool air flowed outward from the opening, carrying no scent, no dust, no sign of decay. The interior was intact, illuminated faintly by the lattice's reflected resonance, casting soft geometric patterns across walls that appeared grown rather than assembled. This was not a hollow metal shell. It was an engineered environment. I stepped inside. The moment my boots crossed the threshold, the aperture sealed behind me, restoring the exterior surface to its seamless state, isolating me completely from the desert outside. There was no panic, no sense of entrapment, because the internal systems had already adjusted to my biological presence. Temperature stabilized. Atmosphérique composition normalised. Pressure equalized. It had prepared for me before I entered. The corridor ahead curved gently toward the core chamber, following the same circular architecture visible in the scans, guiding movement without corners, without sharp angles, without obstruction. This was not a defensive interior. It was an adaptive one. And as I moved deeper toward the crystalline lattice, the resonance within the structure intensified slightly. Not unstable, not chaotic, but anticipatory. It had allowed me inside, not as an intruder, but as a participant. The corridor did not feel like a passage built for transport. It felt like a transition. The walls were smooth, but not metallic, their surface subtly textured with faint, flowing patterns that shifted under the lattice's light as I moved, almost as if the material itself was responsive to motion, recalibrating its internal structure to maintain perfect equilibrium around me. There were no visible cables, no exposed conduits, no mechanical supports. Everything was integrated into the architecture itself, grown into a single continuous form that curved inward as I approached the central chamber. And then the space opened. The crystalline lattice hovered in the center of a vast circular cavity, suspended without visible support, rotating slowly along multiple axes in perfect synchronization with a rhythm my instruments identified as planetary in origin. It was not spinning randomly. It was matching tectonic resonance. Each rotation aligned with deep seismic frequencies traveling through the planet's crust. The realization settled heavily in my chest. This structure was not simply stabilizing the surface. It was regulating the planet's internal stress, balancing forces that would otherwise fracture continents over geological time. The fractures in the lattice were more visible now, thin hairline disruptions along its inner geometry, glowing faintly where containment strain was highest. I approached carefully. The air inside the chamber vibrated at a frequency just below audible range, creating a pressure sensation behind my ears. The scanner, still integrated at the interface node, was now projecting data directly onto my visor. Containment variance, 2.3%, increasing, slowly, predictably. But the moment I stepped onto the circular platform surrounding the lattice, the readings changed again. The resonance stabilized. Not fully, but measurably. The system had incorporated my mass into its equilibrium calculations. It was using me as a variable, testing the effect of human presence on containment stability. The lattice brightened slightly, its internal geometry shifting, reconfiguring microalignments that corresponded to my position in the chamber. It was not asking me to repair it mechanically. It was asking for synchronization. My heartbeat began to align subtly with the chamber's vibration, not forcibly, gradually, as if the system was tuning itself to a biological rhythm. This was no longer salvage in the traditional sense. There were no broken panels to replace, no damaged circuits to weld. The repair required interaction, alignment, and understanding. The fractures were not caused by external damage. They were caused by imbalance over time. An imbalance could only be corrected by introducing a new stabilizing variable. For the first time since entering the desert, I understood why the structure had responded to me specifically. Not because I was advanced, not because I was chosen, but because I was present. And presence was enough. The lattice pulsed once, softly, waiting. The pulse was not a surge of energy. It was an invitation, a modulation of frequency that adjusted the air pressure in the chamber by the smallest measurable margin, just enough for my body to register that something had shifted, that something had aligned itself with me rather than around me. The platform beneath my feet responded next. A faint circular glow formed along its perimeter, not bright enough to illuminate the chamber, but distinct enough to indicate activation. The glow expanded inward slowly, forming concentric rings that corresponded exactly to the lattice's rotational axis. My visor flooded with updated projections. Containment variance dropped to 1.9%, then 1.7%. The change was subtle but undeniable. The system was recalculating equilibrium with my biological rhythm integrated into its harmonic field. I did not move. Even breathing felt like an input. The lattice's fractures glowed brighter for a moment, then dimmed slightly, as if stress was being redistributed rather than amplified. This was not a patch, not a repair in the mechanical sense. It was a recalibration. The structure had endured centuries of planetary strain without adaptive feedback. Now, it had a dynamic reference point, a living oscillator. The resonance in the chamber deepened, no longer just a planetary echo, but a blended waveform that carried both tectonic rhythm and cardiac cadence. For a brief moment, I felt disoriented, not from fear but from scale. The realization that my presence was now mathematically embedded into a system regulating continental stability was overwhelming. But the system did not overload. It stabilized. Containment variance, 1.3%. Holding. The lattice slowed its multi-axis rotation, settling into a new alignment that differed slightly from the original blueprint. Not damaged. Evolved. This was what it had been waiting for. Not replacement parts. Not external power. Interaction. The creators of this structure had designed it with an open parameter, a margin for integration. They had known that eventually something new would emerge on this planet, something capable of stepping inside, not to take control, but to participate. The fractures did not disappear. They remained as faint reminders of accumulated strain, but they no longer propagated. The probability curves updated one final time. Containment stability extended, not by years, by centuries. The system did not celebrate. It did not signal completion. It simply continued, but now it continued with me included. And in that silent continuation, I understood something far more important than how the structure worked. I understood why it had revealed itself. It had not been waiting to be saved. It had been waiting to be joined. The calm in the chamber was deceptive. The lattice rotated steadily, and the resonance field had stabilized, but my instruments, though integrated into the system, continued to display subtle fluctuations I could not ignore. Every slight hesitation in my movements, every micro-adjustment of posture or breath was feeding into the system's calculations, subtly altering equilibrium in ways I could not fully anticipate. I realized then that being here was not neutral. Observation alone had consequences, but active participation magnified them. Each alignment, I introduced redistributed forces across the crystalline lattice, and, by extension, through the planetary structure it regulated. Localized pressure zones, tectonic vectors, and even desert floor microgravity shifted imperceptibly, all precisely because the system now accounted for my presence. The scanner flashed a warning I had not seen before. Operator integration, active. The words were calm, factual, but the meaning was profound. I was no longer an external agent assessing the vessel. I had become an intrinsic component of its operation. If I moved, it adjusted. If I hesitated, it compensated. If I left, the probability curves indicated inevitable degradation, slow but relentless. I knelt beside the lattice and ran a low-frequency diagnostic pulse, testing whether my actions would continue to stabilize the fractures. The structure responded immediately, micro-aligning its internal crystalline nodes and adjusting resonance across the chamber. For the first time, I felt like part of a living system, not merely a restorer. And yet the cost was unmistakable. By integrating me, the vessel had created dependency. It had evolved from a passive containment system into a network requiring a conscious operator to maintain balance. Walking away would not just relinquish control. It would accelerate failure. Slowly, methodically, irreversibly. The air hummed faintly as the lattice pulsed. I could sense its awareness, patient, analytical, but indifferent to human comfort. It did not care about my fatigue, my doubts, or my fear. My presence was simply part of the equation now, a variable the system could not ignore. This was the paradox of restoration at this scale. To save the structure, I must remain. To remain is to accept responsibility for a planetary balance far beyond human comprehension. I was no longer a spectator. I was a guardian. The projection updated once more. Operator presence required, continuous. No options. No negotiation. Only truth. I took a deep breath. I had crossed the line. There was no turning back. Silence settled around me. But it was the kind of silence heavy with expectation, the quiet of a system that had just acknowledged the full scope of its operator. The crystalline lattice continued its slow, multi-axis rotation, perfectly aligned to the planet's internal rhythms. Yet now its equilibrium included me. My presence folded into the calculations as though I had always been part of the design. The scanner pulsed softly, projecting the final probability curves for the first time since I entered the core chamber. Centuries of degradation, fractures, and stress were now projected forward with my influence included. The numbers told a simple, unavoidable truth. Humanity had stumbled into something far larger than itself, a system that had endured millennia alone, and now, for the first time, it required conscious stewardship. Every movement, every choice, every hesitation became part of a delicate chain reaction. The lattice did not demand action. It demanded attention. Presence alone recalibrated containment. Absence would accelerate decay. The structure was patient, impartial, but unwavering. Its function was planetary balance, not survival, not morality, not empathy. And yet, because I was here, it had begun accounting for human variables. Instinct, hesitation, emotional bias, all now part of the harmonic field. I stepped back slightly, letting the scanner project the full structural layout across my visor. The fractures, the realignment of nodes, the recalculated equilibrium, all of it was clear. This was no longer a salvage mission. This was stewardship, a responsibility that could not be abandoned. The desert outside, the planetary crust beneath, the orbital harmonics above, they were all now variables I influenced intentionally or not. For the first time, I understood the Creator's intent. They had designed a system that could endure eons alone, precise and indifferent. They had also left a margin, a way for another intelligence to integrate, to maintain continuity. I was not replacing them. I was joining. And in that joining, the scale of responsibility became undeniable. To leave now would be to accelerate the failure of a structure holding a planet together. To stay was to bind myself to a cycle of observation, adjustment, and adaptation that could span a lifetime or longer. The lattice pulsed once more, brighter and steadier. The chamber no longer felt alien. It felt precise, alive, and indifferent to human notions of right or wrong. I had become part of it, a node in a network that was both alien and impossibly familiar in its logic. And in that clarity, there was no fear, only understanding. We are never truly observers of systems this vast. Once we see them, we are participants. Once we interact, we are responsible. I exhaled. The desert outside remained quiet. The ship, no longer dormant, no longer hidden, had accepted its first human steward. And from that moment onward, I knew the balance was ours to maintain.